My name is Malcolm of Lanark, and I sit here in this English cell writing these words with a trembling hand, because if I do not, I fear I shall go mad with the memory of what I witnessed. They made us watch, you understand. They brought us Scots prisoners down from the tower in chains, lined us up at Smithfield like we were honoured guests at some great spectacle, and they made us watch while they tore William Wallace apart. That was 6 months ago now, August the 23rd, in the year of our Lord 1305, and I can still smell the blood, still hear the sound the blade made when it opened his belly, still see the smoke rising from his burning guts. I have seen men die in battle. I have killed men myself, taken English lives with sword and spear in the name of Scotland's freedom. But what they did to Wallace at Smithfield, that was not war. That was not justice. That was something else entirely. Something meant to break not just a man's body, but a whole nation's spirit. I do not think they succeeded, though God knows they tried. I was there at the beginning, you see, not at Stirling Bridge or Falkirk. Those great battles belong to other men's stories. But at Lanark, in the spring of '97, when Wallace struck his first blow against English tyranny. I was barely 20 years old then, working my father's small plot of land outside the town, when word came that Wallace had killed the English sheriff. William Heselrig was his name, the bastard who ruled over us with Norman contempt and an iron fist. They said Wallace cut him down in the street, him and his men, killed Heselrig and 50 of his soldiers and set fire to the English quarters. I did not see it happen, but I saw the smoke rising over Lanark that morning, black and thick against the spring sky. By nightfall, I had joined Wallace's growing band. What else could a young man do? The country was crawling with English garrisons, our King John Balliol stripped of his crown and imprisoned in England. Our nobles bent the knee to Edward Longshanks one by one. Then this man Wallace appeared, a knight's son from Elderslie, tall and fierce and burning with a fury that lit something in all of us. And suddenly, there was a choice that had not existed before. You could submit to English rule, or you could fight. I chose to fight. We all did. Hundreds of us at first, then thousands. Through that summer and into autumn we harried the English, raiding their supply trains, ambushing their patrols, melting back into the forests and hills they could never fully control. Wallace knew the land like he knew his own soul. Every deer path, every hidden valley, every ford and bridge. He taught us to strike fast and disappear, to use our knowledge of Scotland against men who saw it only as territory to be conquered. And we loved him for it, for giving us back our manhood, for showing us that English steel could bleed just like ours. Then came Stirling Bridge. I was there that day, September the 11th, '97, standing in the schiltron with my spear braced and my heart hammering in my chest as we watched the English army cross that narrow bridge. They were so confident, so certain of their superiority, thousands of armoured knights and men-at-arms, the finest soldiers in Christendom, marching to crush a rabble of Scottish rebels. But Wallace had chosen his ground perfectly. He let them cross, let half their army commit to the north bank of the Forth, and then he unleashed us. I will never forget the sound of that charge. Hundreds of Scots screaming like demons as we crashed into the disordered English lines. I will never forget the look on their faces when they realized they were trapped. The bridge clogged with retreating soldiers, the river at their backs, nowhere to run. We slaughtered them, not in honorable combat, not in the clean clash of shield walls, but in desperate, brutal butchery. I killed 3 men that day. The first was a young English squire who slipped in the mud and went down under my spear. The second was an older soldier who fought well but caught my blade in his throat. The third I do not remember clearly, just blood and screaming and the terrible press of bodies. When it was over, the river ran red. Hugh de Cressingham, Edward's treasurer in Scotland, lay dead among the corpses. They flayed him afterward, took strips of his skin for belts and baldricks. I did not participate in that. It seemed excessive even to me, drunk as I was on victory, but I understood the hatred that drove it. Cressingham had been a cruel man, grinding taxes out of a conquered people to fund their own subjugation. Wallace was named Guardian of Scotland after Stirling, appointed to rule in the name of the imprisoned King John. For 9 months, he was the closest thing we had to a free kingdom. He raided into northern England, burning and pillaging in repayment for English raids on Scottish soil. He tried to bring order to the chaos, to forge alliances, to make the Norman lords of Scotland remember they were Scots first and vassals of Edward II. It was glorious while it lasted. But Edward Longshanks is not a man to suffer defeat lightly. They call him the Hammer of the Scots, and by God, the name is earned. In the summer of '98, he came north with the largest army I have ever seen, 20,000 men, maybe more, with thousands of armoured cavalry and Welsh longbowmen whose arrows fell like deadly rain. We met him at Falkirk on the 22nd of July. I was in the 3rd Schiltron, a great circular formation of spearmen, when the English attacked. Our cavalry fled early. The Scottish nobles could never commit fully to Wallace, could never quite forget that he was a younger son of a minor knight, not one of their own. Without horsemen to screen us, we stood in our hedgehog formations and endured the English arrows. They darkened the sky, those arrows. They punched through leather and quilted gambesons, found the gaps in helmets, turned proud men into screaming, broken things. My Schiltron held longer than most. We were still standing when the English knights finally charged. But in the end, it did not matter. The longbowmen had done their work. We were too weakened, too bloodied. When the heavy cavalry hit us, our lines shattered. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran, along with hundreds of others, fleeing into the woods while the English cut down those too slow or too loyal to abandon their posts. Wallace escaped as well, though he resigned the guardianship shortly after. How could he not? Falkirk was a disaster, and the nobles who had never trusted him were quick to blame him for the defeat. He spent the next 7 years fighting on, sometimes raiding, sometimes seeking support from France or Rome, always moving, always one step ahead of Edward's men. I thought he was untouchable. I thought his knowledge of Scotland and his network of loyal men would keep him safe forever. I was wrong. They took me first, actually. A stupid mistake. I was careless, too confident after a successful raid on an English supply wagon near Dumbarton. Their patrol caught me on the road south, recognized me from some informer's description. I spent 3 days in Dumbarton Castle being questioned, which is to say, beaten, then transferred to a prison hulk for the journey to London. There were a dozen of us Scots on that ship, chained in the stinking hold, eating mouldy bread and drinking brackish water while the vessel rocked its way down the coast. We did not know why we were being taken to England. Some thought ransom, others feared execution. None of us guessed the truth. We arrived in London in late July and were thrown into the Tower. The cells there are old Norman stonework, dark and damp, with narrow windows that let in barely any light. Rats scuttled in the corners. The straw on the floor was filthy and crawling with lice. We were fed once a day, thin gruel and hard bread, and left to rot in the summer heat. It was there, in that cell, that I heard Wallace had been captured. One of the guards told me, grinning as he delivered the news. "Your great hero fell at last," he said, in his thick London accent. "Taken near Glasgow, betrayed by one of his own. He'll hang before the month is out." I did not believe him at first. Wallace betrayed? Impossible. But as the days passed and more details filtered down, carried by guards, by the priest who came once to hear confessions by the whispers of other prisoners, I realized it was true. John de Menteith, the sheriff of Dumbarton, had turned Wallace over to the English, a Scot, one of our own. The betrayal stung worse than any wound I had taken in battle. Wallace arrived in London on the 22nd of August. They held him in the Tower overnight, in a cell not far from mine, though I did not see him. I heard he was kept in chains, that he was allowed no visitors, that he spent his last night in silence and prayer. The next morning, they came for all of us, the Scottish prisoners. "You're to witness English justice," the captain of the guard told us as they unlocked our cells. "You're to see what happens to traitors and rebels, and then you're to go back to Scotland and tell everyone what you saw." They did not plan to execute us, you see. They planned to use us. We were to be their messengers, carrying the story of Wallace's death back to Scotland like a plague, infecting our countrymen with fear and despair. They marched us through the streets in chains, a dozen ragged Scots surrounded by English soldiers, while the London crowds jeered and spat. The city was enormous, far larger than Edinburgh or Stirling, a maze of narrow streets and tall buildings that seemed to press in from all sides. The smell was overwhelming: human waste, rotting garbage, smoke from countless fires, the Thames itself a stinking open sewer. We were taken to Westminster first, to the great hall where Wallace was to be tried. They made us stand at the back, behind the English nobles and clerics who filled the space, and watch as they brought him in. I had not seen Wallace in years, not since Falkirk, and I barely recognized him. He had aged, his face lined and weathered, his hair streaked with grey. But his eyes were the same, burning with that fierce intelligence and unbreakable will. They had crowned him with a laurel wreath, mockery of his claim to be guardian of Scotland. He stood before the judges in chains, his head high, and listened as they read the charges. Treason, they said, murder, sacrilege, arson. He had rebelled against his rightful king, Edward of England. He had killed English subjects. He had burned churches. The list went on and on, each crime more exaggerated than the last. When they finished, one of the judges asked if he had anything to say. Wallace's voice carried through the hall, clear and strong despite his captivity. "I could not be a traitor to Edward," he said, "for I was never his subject. I have never sworn him fealty. I have fought for Scotland's freedom, and I would do so again." The English lords muttered angrily. The judges conferred briefly, then pronounced sentence. He was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The full traitor's death, the most terrible punishment English law allowed. I felt my stomach turn. I had seen men hanged before, seen corpses quartered and displayed, but to see it done to Wallace, to the man who had given us Stirling Bridge, who had shown us we could resist, it was too much to bear. They took him from the hall, and we prisoners were marched out after, back into the London streets. The crowds were already gathering, word of the execution spreading like wildfire. By the time we reached Smithfield, an open area northeast of the city walls where the elms stood, thousands of Englishmen had assembled to watch. They roared when they saw Wallace brought forth, dragged behind a horse like an animal. He was naked, stripped of all dignity, his body already bruised and bloody from the cobblestones. They had tied him to a wooden hurdle, a kind of sledge, and lashed that to the horse's tail. The beast pulled him through the streets while the crowd pelted him with offal and excrement, screaming insults and curses. I was forced to watch from the front, the English guards making sure we Scots had a clear view. I wanted to close my eyes, to turn away, but they would not let me. "Watch," the guard behind me growled, his hand on my shoulder like a vice. "Watch and remember." So I watched. I watched as they dragged Wallace to the base of the elms, where the scaffold stood waiting. I watched as they hauled him up, still living, and fixed the noose around his neck. The executioner was a thick-shouldered man in a leather apron, his arms stained to the elbows with old blood. He worked with the efficiency of long practice, adjusting the rope, checking the knot. Then he stepped back and gave the signal. They hanged Wallace, but not to death. That would have been too merciful. The purpose of hanging in this sentence was strangulation, bringing the condemned to the very edge of death, face purpled, eyes bulging, tongue protruding, and then cutting them down while they still lived. I watched Wallace's body jerk and twitch as the rope tightened, watched him struggle for air that would not come, watched the light begin to fade from his eyes. The crowd roared its approval, a sound like hunting hounds baying for blood. The stench of sweat and excitement hung thick in the August heat. Just before he lost consciousness, they cut him down. He fell to the platform, gasping and retching, his chest heaving as he tried to draw breath. The executioner did not give him time to recover. The executioner moved quickly, with the practiced motions of a man who had done this work many times before. Wallace lay on the wooden platform, still gasping from the hanging, his naked body trembling with the effort of drawing breath. The crowd pressed closer, craning for a better view, and the English guards shoved us Scots forward until we were only a few paces from the scaffold, close enough to see every detail of what was about to happen. I could smell the blood already, coppery and sharp, mixing with the acrid stench of fear sweat and the smoke from the fires they had prepared nearby. The executioner knelt beside Wallace with a long knife, the blade gleaming in the afternoon sun. For a moment, Wallace's eyes focused on him, clear and defiant despite the agony he must have been feeling. I saw his lips move, whether in prayer or curse, I could not tell, and then the executioner began his work. First, the emasculation. I will not describe it in detail, for even now the memory makes me sick. Suffice it to say that the executioner cut away Wallace's manhood with swift, brutal strokes, while Wallace, still conscious, arched his back and screamed. It was not a human sound, that scream. It was something primal, torn from the deepest part of a man's soul, a sound I pray to God I never hear again. The crowd cheered. They actually cheered, as if they were watching some entertainment at a fair rather than the systematic destruction of a human being. I felt the man next to me, a Scot named Robert from Ayrshire, sag against his chains, his face gone white as bone. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God," he whispered, and began to pray in a desperate mumble. The executioner tossed the severed parts into one of the fires, where they sizzled and popped. The smell of burning flesh reached us a moment later, and I had to swallow hard against the bile rising in my throat. But it was not finished. Not nearly finished. The disemboweling came next. Wallace was still alive, still conscious, though his screams had faded to broken gasps and moans. The executioner positioned his knife just below the ribcage and began to cut. The sound it made, the wet, tearing sound of steel parting flesh, is something I hear in my nightmares still. He worked with awful precision, opening Wallace from breastbone to groin, peeling back the layers of muscle and fat to expose the organs within. Steam rose from the wound in the summer heat. Blood poured across the platform in thick streams, pooling at the edges and dripping through the cracks to the ground below. The executioner reached into the cavity he had created and began to pull out Wallace's intestines, hand over hand, like a man hauling rope. The crowd pressed even closer, fascinated and horrified in equal measure. Some were laughing. Others had gone silent, their faces pale, but their eyes locked on the spectacle. A few had turned away, unable to watch any longer, but most stayed, drinking in every moment of Wallace's agony. The executioner draped the intestines across a wooden frame and cast them into the fire. They hissed and steamed, releasing a smell so foul that several people in the crowd retched and stumbled away. But Wallace was still alive. His eyes were open, though glazed with shock and pain. His mouth moved silently. I do not know if he was praying or cursing, or simply beyond the ability to form words. His hands clenched and unclenched weakly at his sides. He should have been dead already. Any normal man would have been dead. But Wallace had always been more than normal, stronger, tougher, more stubborn than anyone I had ever known. Even now, even as they literally tore him apart, he clung to life with a tenacity that seemed to unnerve even the executioner. The man paused in his work, glanced at Wallace's face, then reached deeper into the abdominal cavity. He pulled out what I think was the liver, a dark, glistening mass of tissue, and added it to the fire. More organs followed. The heart came last, the executioner cutting it free from its moorings and holding it aloft for the crowd to see. That brought a renewed roar of approval from the English, a wave of sound that washed over us like a physical force. "Behold the heart of a traitor!" someone shouted, and the cry was taken up by 100 voices. "Death to all enemies of England! Long live King Edward!" The executioner threw the heart into the flames, and finally, the light went out of Wallace's eyes. His body went slack, the last tension draining from his muscles, and he was gone. I had thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The beheading came next. The executioner wiped his knife on a rag, then selected a heavy axe from the tools laid out beside the scaffold. He positioned Wallace's head, careful even now, even with a corpse, and brought the blade down with a solid, meaty thunk. It took 3 blows to sever the head completely, each one accompanied by the sound of cracking bone and tearing flesh. When it finally came free, the executioner lifted it by the hair and showed it to the crowd. The face was barely recognizable, purpled from the hanging, slack in death, the eyes half open and staring at nothing. Blood dripped from the ragged stump of the neck, pattering on the platform like rain. The crowd's roar reached a crescendo. People were screaming, cheering, some weeping with emotion. It was madness, a collective frenzy that seemed to have seized the entire assembly. I stood there in my chains, numb with horror, and wondered what kind of people could take such joy in another man's suffering. The quartering was almost anticlimactic after everything else. The executioner and his assistants dragged Wallace's headless corpse to a heavy wooden block and began the work of dismemberment. They took the arms first, chopping through the shoulder joints with the axe, then the legs at the hips. Each blow sent a fresh spray of blood across the platform. Flies had already begun to gather, buzzing around the pooling gore in thick black clouds. When it was done, they had 5 pieces, the head and 4 limbs. The torso, what was left of it, was a hollow shell, emptied of organs and leaking fluids. They would burn that later, I learned, to prevent any relics being taken. The English had learned from Thomas Becket and other martyred saints. They knew the power of holy remains to inspire rebellion. They were taking no chances with Wallace. One of the English officials stepped forward as the executioner cleaned his tools. He was a noble of some kind, dressed in fine robes that seemed obscene in the context of the butchery we had just witnessed. He addressed the crowd in a loud, carrying voice. "Let this be a lesson to all who would defy the king's justice," he proclaimed. William Wallace was a traitor and a murderer, an outlaw who brought war and suffering to peaceful lands. He has paid the price for his crimes, and his fate awaits any man who follows his path of rebellion. The king's mercy is great, but his justice is greater still. Remember what you have seen here today, and let it guide your actions. Then he turned to us, the Scottish prisoners. His eyes were cold, calculating. "You will be released," he said, his voice dropping so that only we could hear over the crowd's noise. "You will be given provisions for the journey north and safe passage through English territory, and you will tell your countrymen what happened here. You will tell them that England's power cannot be challenged, that rebellion brings only death and suffering. Tell them that William Wallace died screaming, died like a dog, died because he dared to defy his rightful king. Tell them all of this, and perhaps, there will be no need for further examples." I wanted to spit in his face. I wanted to tell him that Wallace's death would inspire more rebellion, not less, but I held my tongue. I was exhausted, traumatized, and I wanted nothing more than to leave this cursed place and return to Scotland. So I nodded, as did the other prisoners, and we let them believe they had broken us. They marched us away from Smithfield as the crowd began to disperse. Behind us, the executioner and his assistants were preparing Wallace's remains for display. The head would go to London Bridge, I learned later, to be dipped in tar and mounted on a spike as a warning to all who entered the city. The 4 quarters would be sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, one to each corner of Scotland, so that the whole kingdom would know of Wallace's fate. As we walked through the London streets back toward the tower, I noticed small groups of people standing in doorways and alleys, watching us pass. Some were English, still celebrating their victory, but others had the look of Scots about them, or of northern Englishmen who had no love for Edward's harsh rule. They did not cheer, they did not jeer, they simply watched, their faces somber, and in their eyes I saw not triumph, but a kind of quiet fury. It gave me hope, that look, hope that the English noble's words were wrong, that Wallace's death would not end the fight for Scotland's freedom. They kept us in the tower for 3 more days, processing our release with the glacial slowness of English bureaucracy. In that time, I learned more details about Wallace's final weeks. He had been betrayed at Robroyston, near Glasgow, by John de Menteith, acting on Edward's orders. Some said a servant named Jack Short had actually done the deed, pointing out Wallace's location to the English soldiers. Others claimed Menteith himself had led the raid. It did not matter, really. What mattered was that a Scot had sold Scotland's greatest defender for English gold and the promise of lands and titles. The journey from Glasgow to London had taken more than 2 weeks, Wallace transported in chains under heavy guard. They had displayed him in various towns along the way, letting the English crowds gawk and jeer, building anticipation for the execution in London. He had been held in the Tower for only 1 night before the trial, given no chance to prepare a defence, no opportunity to speak with allies or seek counsel. The trial itself had been a farce, the verdict predetermined before Wallace ever entered Westminster Hall. English justice, they called it. I call it murder, dressed in legal robes. On the 4th day, they released us. We were given travelling clothes to replace our rags, a small purse of coins for food, and papers guaranteeing safe passage through English-held territory. The captain of the guard, who handed me my papers, leaned in close as he did so. "Remember what you saw, Scotsman," he said quietly. "Remember, and choose wisely, how you live the rest of your life." I took the papers without comment and left the tower, joining the other released prisoners in the courtyard outside. We set out that same day, eager to put London and its horrors behind us. The journey north took nearly a month. We travelled in a group for safety, using the coins they had given us to buy food in English towns and sleeping rough when we reached the border country. As we passed through Newcastle, I saw Wallace's right leg on display, or what was left of it, for the crows had already been at the flesh. It hung from a chain outside the town gate, a grim warning to anyone entering from Scotland. I did not stop to look at it for long, but the sight burned itself into my memory anyway. We crossed into Scotland in late September, nearly a month after the execution. I expected to find the country cowed, beaten down by the news of Wallace's death. Instead, I found it seething with quiet rage. In the villages and towns we passed through, people gathered to hear our account of what had happened in London. I told them what I had seen, sparing no detail, and I watched their faces as I spoke. Some wept, some cursed, but all of them, every single one, grew harder, more determined. "They think they have broken us," an old woman said in a village near Stirling. "They think that killing Wallace will end our resistance, but they have made a mistake. They have given us a martyr." She was right, I realized. In their eagerness to make an example of Wallace, the English had transformed him from a man into a symbol. They had taken his mortal body and scattered it across Scotland, but in doing so, they had planted seeds of resistance that would grow in ways they could never control. I returned to Lanark in October, 8 months after I had been captured, and 3 months after Wallace's execution. The town had changed little in my absence, the same stone buildings, the same narrow streets, the same people going about their daily lives under the shadow of English occupation. But I had changed. I was no longer the young man who had joined Wallace's rebellion with fire in his heart and certainty in his soul. I had seen too much, suffered too much, understood too much about the true cost of resistance. The English sheriff who had replaced Heselrig, a man named Thomas de Burgh, summoned me within a week of my return. I went to the castle expecting arrest or execution, but instead I found something more subtle and more dangerous. De Burgh was a career administrator, not a warrior, and he understood that brute force alone could not hold Scotland. He needed collaborators, men who would help maintain English rule from within. "You have seen what happens to rebels," he said, sitting behind his desk like a merchant discussing a trade deal. "You were there when Wallace died. Surely you understand now that resistance is futile, that Scotland's future lies in cooperation with England, not in futile warfare." I nodded slowly, keeping my face neutral. "I saw what happened to Wallace," I agreed. "You would be wise to take the lesson to heart. There is a place for men like you in the new Scotland we are building, men who understand both sides, who can help keep the peace. I am authorized to offer you a position in the town watch with a regular wage and certain privileges. All you need do is swear loyalty to King Edward and help maintain order in Lanark." I considered his offer carefully. Part of me, the exhausted, traumatized part that had seen Wallace torn apart at Smithfield, wanted to accept, wanted to lay down my arms, to take the easy path, to survive rather than resist. But then I thought of Wallace's eyes as they brought him into Westminster Hall, still burning with defiance despite the chains and the crown of mockery. I thought of his words. I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. I thought of the old woman in the village near Stirling, planting seeds of resistance in the furrows of English cruelty. I need time to consider, I told de Burgh, and he nodded, satisfied that he had planted his own seed in my mind. I left the castle and walked to the spot where 8 years earlier Wallace had killed Sheriff Heselrig and sparked the rebellion. There was no marker, no monument. The English had made sure of that. But I knew the place. I could almost see it still. The sheriff's blood spreading across the cobblestones, the English soldiers lying dead in their quarters, the smoke rising from the fires. What had it accomplished, that first blow? Wallace was dead, his body scattered across Scotland. The English still ruled from their castles, still collected their taxes, still hanged those who resisted. We had won Stirling Bridge, yes, but lost Falkirk and a dozen smaller battles besides. We had fought for 8 years and achieved what exactly? Freedom? Scotland was less free now than it had been before Wallace struck. I stood there, wrestling with these dark thoughts, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find a young man, perhaps 16 or 17, watching me with eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of my own younger self. "You are Malcolm of Lanark," he said. It was not a question. "You were there when they killed Wallace. I heard you speak of it in the village near Stirling." "I was there," I confirmed. "I saw it all." "Then you know what the English are capable of. You know what they will do to us if we do not resist." I shook my head. "I know what they will do to us if we do resist. I watched them disembowel William Wallace while he still lived. I watched them burn his organs and quarter his body and mount his head on London Bridge. Resistance brought him nothing but the most terrible death imaginable." The young man's jaw tightened. "Resistance brought him glory," he said fiercely. "Resistance brought him immortality. 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, men will still speak Wallace's name with reverence. Can the same be said of those who collaborated with the English, who bent the knee and accepted their rule?" I had no answer for that. He continued, his voice rising with passion. "Wallace showed us that we could fight, that we could win. Stirling Bridge proved that Scottish spears could break English cavalry, that we were not helpless before their armies. Falkirk was a defeat, yes, but it was not the end. It is never the end, as long as we remember what we are fighting for." "And what are we fighting for?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Wallace is dead. Our king is imprisoned in England. Our nobles squabble among themselves, each seeking advantage over the others. What exactly do you think we can achieve that Wallace could not?" He looked at me with something like pity. "We fight for Scotland," he said simply. "Not for a king, not for a noble, not for personal glory. For Scotland herself, for the idea that this land belongs to the people who live on it, not to foreign conquerors." Wallace understood that. That is why they had to kill him, because his vision was more dangerous to them than any army. After he left, I walked through Lanark for hours, turning his words over in my mind. Everywhere I looked, I saw the evidence of English occupation, soldiers in English livery, English laws posted on the church door, English taxes collected in English coin. But I also saw Scottish faces, Scottish voices, Scottish stubbornness that no amount of occupation could quite extinguish. That night, I made my decision. I would not take de Burgh's offer. I would not collaborate with the English, would not help them maintain their grip on Scotland. But neither would I take up arms again, would not throw my life away in futile gestures of defiance. Instead, I would do something more subtle, more lasting. I would bear witness. I would tell Wallace's story, not the English version, where he died screaming and defeated, but the true version, where he defied them to the end and proved that Scottish courage could not be broken, no matter what horrors they inflicted. I would keep his memory alive, would plant it in the minds of everyone who would listen, would nurture it until it grew into something that could not be killed with knives or ropes or fires. I am an old man now, writing these words nearly 20 years after Wallace's death. Much has happened in those years. Robert the Bruce, who was silent at Westminster Hall, who did not lift a finger to save Wallace, rose in rebellion the following year, was crowned King of Scotland, and led us to victory at Bannockburn in 1314. Edward Longshanks is dead, gone to whatever judgment awaits men who build their glory on the suffering of others. His son, weak and ineffectual, could not hold what his father had conquered. Scotland is free again, or as free as any nation can be in this world of kings and wars and shifting alliances. But I sometimes wonder what Wallace would think of it all. Would he approve of Bruce, who once fought for the English before turning against them? Would he accept the compromises, the political marriages, the treaties that preserved Scottish independence at the cost of certain principles? I do not know. I know only that without Wallace's rebellion, without his defiance, without his sacrifice, there would have been no Bannockburn, no independent Scotland. He lit the fire that others tended until it burned away English rule. I never took up arms again after returning from London. I farmed my land, raised a family, lived the quiet life I had once thought would be enough. But I have told Wallace's story countless times, to my children, to travelers, to anyone who would listen. I have made sure that they know not just how he died, but how he lived, what he fought for, why it mattered. The English thought they could break our spirit by destroying Wallace's body. They were wrong. You cannot kill a man's legacy with a knife, cannot burn his ideals in a fire, cannot scatter his influence by quartering his corpse. If anything, they made him stronger in death than he ever was in life, transformed him from a mortal man into an immortal symbol of resistance against tyranny. I still dream of Smithfield sometimes. I still see the executioner's knife opening Wallace's belly, still smell the burning flesh, still hear the crowd's terrible roar. But I also remember the moment when Wallace spoke at Westminster, his voice clear and unshaken, despite everything they had done and were about to do to him. I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. Those words have echoed through the years, inspiring rebellion after rebellion, reminding each new generation that allegiance must be earned, not demanded, that power without justice is only tyranny dressed in fine robes. I am too old now to care much what the English think of this account. I know they have their own version of events, their own justifications for what they did to Wallace. They will say he was a brigand, a murderer, a traitor who got what he deserved. They will point to the lives he took, the towns he burned, the chaos his rebellion created. They are not entirely wrong, I suppose. Wallace was not a saint, not a perfect hero from some minstrel's tale. He could be brutal when he thought brutality was necessary, ruthless in pursuit of his goals, blind to consequences that should have been obvious. He made mistakes, military mistakes, political mistakes, personal mistakes. He was, in the end, only a man. But he was a man who stood for something larger than himself. A man who could have bent the knee, could have sought Edward's pardon, could have lived in comfort and safety, if only he had been willing to betray his principles. Instead, he chose defiance. He chose to fight for Scottish independence, even when the cause seemed hopeless, even when the cost was certain to be terrible, even when wiser men counseled surrender. And when they finally caught him, when they brought him to London in chains to face the certain knowledge of the most agonizing death their law could devise, he refused to give them what they wanted. He refused to repent, refused to beg for mercy, refused to acknowledge Edward as his rightful king. He stood before them in that laurel crown and denied their authority over him, their right to judge him, their claim that resistance was treason. That is what I remember most clearly from Smithfield, not the blood or the screaming or the butchery, though God knows those memories haunt me still, but Wallace's unbreakable defiance. Even as they tore him apart, even as they burned his organs before his dying eyes, he would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him broken. His body died, yes, but his spirit escaped them. It escaped and spread across Scotland like seeds on the wind, taking root wherever it found hearts ready to receive it. Within a year of his death, Bruce was in rebellion. Within 9 years, we had won Bannockburn. Within 15 years, we had forced the English to recognise our independence in the Treaty of Edinburgh. Wallace did not live to see any of it, but none of it would have been possible without him. I am often asked what Wallace was really like. What manner of man could inspire such devotion and such hatred in equal measure? I wish I could give a simple answer, but the truth is complicated, as truth usually is. He was tall, yes, taller than most men, and strong, with a warrior's build and a knight's training. But physical prowess was common enough among fighting men. What set Wallace apart was something else, something harder to define. He had a gift for inspiring loyalty, for making ordinary men believe they could achieve extraordinary things. When he spoke of Scotland's freedom, it was not abstract rhetoric. You could feel his conviction, his absolute certainty that the cause was just and the fight was worth any sacrifice. He made you want to be better than you were, braver than you thought possible, willing to risk everything for an idea that seemed to matter more than mere survival. But he could also be cold, calculating, willing to make hard decisions that other men shied away from. I saw him order men to their deaths, knowing it was necessary for the greater good. I saw him burn villages to deny the English supplies, even though Scottish families lived in those villages. I saw him execute prisoners when mercy would have been dangerous, hang collaborators to send a message, destroy property to prevent it falling into enemy hands. War requires such decisions, I understand that now. But it troubled me then, this gap between the noble cause we fought for and the brutal means we sometimes used to fight for it. Wallace understood, I think, that resistance is never clean, never simple, never the straightforward tale of good against evil that people prefer to believe. It is messy and complicated, and sometimes requires you to do terrible things in service of a larger purpose. The question is whether the purpose justifies the means, whether the end truly excuses the path taken to reach it. I have spent 20 years wrestling with that question, and I still have no certain answer. What I know is this: Scotland is free because William Wallace refused to submit. That freedom came at a terrible cost. Thousands dead in battles and raids, towns burned, families destroyed, the country ravaged by years of warfare. But the alternative was perpetual subjugation, the slow extinction of Scottish identity under the weight of English rule. Wallace chose resistance, and however much suffering that choice brought, it also brought us the chance to determine our own fate, to govern ourselves, to be Scots rather than merely Edward's subjects. For that, I will remember him with gratitude, despite the nightmares, despite the horror of Smithfield, despite everything. I am Malcolm of Lanark, and I was there when William Wallace died. I watched them tear him apart, and I live still with the memory of it. But I also watched Scotland rise from the ashes of his sacrifice, watched a free kingdom emerge from the blood and chaos of rebellion. If you ask me whether it was worth it, whether Wallace's terrible death and all the suffering that led to it achieved anything of value, I can only tell you this: I am writing these words in Scots, not English. My children speak Scots, worship in Scottish kirks, follow Scottish law. That would not be true if Wallace had submitted, if he had bent the knee and told his followers to accept English rule. He gave us the chance to be Scottish, and he paid for it with the most agonizing death imaginable. May God grant him peace, and may Scotland never forget what he suffered so that we might be free. The guard is coming to collect these pages. They will be smuggled out of this cell. For yes, I am imprisoned again, caught once more in the endless cycle of rebellion and repression that has marked my life. I do not know if I will live to see Scotland again, to walk the hills of Lanarkshire, or stand once more at the spot where Wallace killed Heselrig and started it all. But I know these words will survive, will carry Wallace's story to those who need to hear it, will keep alive the memory of what happened at Smithfield on the 23rd of August, in the year of our Lord, 1305. They killed his body, but they could not kill the idea he died for. They scattered his limbs across Scotland, but in every place they sent them, the people remembered, and the fire of resistance burned brighter. They thought his death would end the rebellion. Instead, it sanctified it, transformed a political struggle into something larger, something that could not be defeated by superior arms or brutal reprisals. England is strong, yes. England is wealthy and powerful and ruled by men who understand the mechanics of conquest. But Scotland is free, and we are free because one man refused to kneel, refused to submit, refused to acknowledge that might makes right. William Wallace was not perfect. He was not a saint or a hero from legend. He was a man, flawed, complicated, sometimes brutal, always stubborn, who made a choice and paid the ultimate price for it. I was there when they killed him. I saw what it cost. And I tell you now, as I told the young man in Lanark all those years ago, it was worth it. Every drop of blood, every moment of agony, every sacrifice made in the name of Scottish freedom, it was worth it, because the alternative was to live on our knees. And Wallace showed us that some things matter more than mere survival. They can take our lives, as they took his. But they cannot take our freedom, not while we remember what he died for and why it mattered. That is my testimony. That is my witness. I was there when William Wallace died, and I tell you this, he won, not in the way he perhaps imagined, not in his lifetime, not without terrible cost, but he won nonetheless, because Scotland endures, free and defiant, a living monument to his unbreakable will. May his memory be eternal, and may we prove worthy of his sacrifice. In the name of Scotland, and in the name of William Wallace, guardian and martyr, I write this account. Let it be remembered. The fire burns low, the voice falls silent. Rest now, the history remains.